That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The British Constitution provides that taxation and representation shall go together. Therefore, women taxpayers are entitled to vote.
I have a dream today. Let freedom ring, and if America is to be a great nation, this must become true.
Hi there. Welcome to episode 31, Only Human Podcast. Today we're going to continue our discussion of leadership through the lens of risk management. And as I promised at the end of the last podcast, we're going to talk about personal risk thresholds, how we all differ in how we view risks. And we're going to find that we fall into one of several categories, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. But I want to start today with a quote. It's a couple paragraphs long, so I hope you'll bear with me. It's from an author named Sophie Scholl, S-C-H-O-O-L, actually S-C-H-O-L-L. Here we go. The real damage is done by those millions who just want to survive. The honest men and women who only want to be left in peace. Those who don't want their little lives disturbed by anything bigger than themselves. Those with no sides and no causes. Those who won't take measure of their own strength for fear of antagonizing their own weaknesses. Those who don't like to make waves or enemies. Those for whom freedom, honor, truth, and principles are only found in literature. Those who live small, mate small, and die small. It's the reductionist approach to life. If you keep it small, you'll keep it under control. If you don't make any noise, the boogeyman won't find you. But it's all an illusion, because they die too. Those people who roll up their spirits into tiny little balls so as to be safe. Safe from what? Life is always on the edge of death. Narrow streets lead to the same place as wide avenues. And a little candle burns itself out just like a flaming torch does. I choose my own way to burn. Sophie Scholl. Cool, eh? So the question I will ask leading into today's podcast is, how do we choose to burn? And why? That's the focus. Do we live small lives? Do we take outrageous risks? Do we take smart risks? It doesn't matter. And in today's world where just to have an opinion can get you canceled and have people try to assassinate your character, trust me, I know about that because I'm not afraid to have public opinions. It seems almost less risky not to have an opinion at all. So we're going to go through that today because I think it's critical. We only get one life and we need to live it to its fullest. So as we go through our podcast today, we're going to, like we almost always do, start with the Blue Threat Proverb of the week. And this week, it's an old friend, Blue Threat Proverb number 14, the risk is not where you think it is. And of course, what that means is when you're thinking about a risk, it suddenly becomes less of a risk because of your heightened awareness. And so when it becomes less of a risk, if you continue to focus on it, you're going to miss other risks and also other opportunities. So we're going to go a little deeper and reflect back on this Blue Threat Proverb as we move on today. But we're going to get into the subject matter of personal risk thresholds. What are they? A personal risk threshold is where you begin to feel uncomfortable about a risk, something that's going on. For those of you that are watching, we've got a picture up on the screen of a young man who's either taking off hang gliding or he's landing hang gliding. I can't tell, but he's pretty excited or he's pretty terrified. I can't tell that either. But anytime we consider risk, we have to consider what it does in terms of allowing us to seize opportunities, right? No risk it, no biscuit, is that what they say? But also what it does in terms of derailing us from something that may be well down the road, a career, a marriage, a drive home, right? But we need to understand that first ping, right, of where we begin to feel uncomfortable is our personal risk threshold, and we can use that. We're going to talk about how we use it in a little bit, but some of this behavior, our risk threshold, is genetic. It comes with us from our ancestors, from our parents, right? Some of it is learned through experience, and some of it's cultural because we get caught up with a bunch of other people, and if they're doing it, it must be okay, especially if they're more experienced or really cool. They're an influencer or something like that. So our risk threshold are shaped in a lot of ways. It's also important to understand that even if you have a low risk threshold, even if you're a naturally cautious person, risk, that's a hard word to say, risk-seeking behavior, right, can come on to any of us gradually or quickly, regardless of what our risk threshold is. There's a lot of reasons for that as well. Risk decisions are made in the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And I mean, one of the reasons people drink or take drugs is because it dulls that portion of our brain and we become less inhibited, almost by definition, clouding our risk decisions, right, physiologically. And we often see risk-seeking behavior begin during an episode where we're not normal. We're caught up in the excitement of something or an event, or we've compromised our own decision-making capability by drinking or drugging, or even fatigue or hypoglycemia can cause some of these things. But regardless, risk-seeking behavior can become addicting, right? To where you always want that next high. We refer to these people, right, as adrenaline junkies. So as we go into this, risk is essential for progress, but it can get out of hand. So how do we balance it? How do we understand us as an individual, and how do we apply it in our personal lives? How do we apply it in our professional lives? How do we apply it as parents? How do we apply it as coworkers? I think it's essential to understand that baseline of risk, that personal risk threshold, in order to move through this. And it all starts with knowing yourself. Here's a risk threshold self-assessment. Those of you that are watching, you can see it up on the screen. We got two gas gauges, right? One is just on the upper edge of the red on empty, and the other is well over half full, but not quite 3/4 full. Now, there's going to be a lot of people that relate to this one. Let's say we're driving cross country and we know pretty soon we're going to have to stop and fill up with gas. We also know from being experienced cross country drivers that gas as you're coming into town tends to be more expensive than gas as you're going out of town by a nickel or so. And so you look at this gas gauge, and let's say you're rolling into El Paso, big city. It takes you about 45 minutes to get through it. My personal risk threshold would say something along like this. We've got at least 15 or 20 more miles. The light's not even on yet. My wife's personal risk threshold goes like this. I never like to get below a half a tank, and I'm stopping at the next exit. Now, if I'm driving, we'll have this discussion, and she always wins, right? Because it's going to be a miserable drive if she gets nervous. So at the end of the day, my risk is not only running out of gas, my risk is alienating my partner in the cockpit, which I'm going to be with for the next several hours. Personal risk threshold says, am I willing to take a chance for a small reward, that 5 cents per gallon? So think about that a little bit. And we're going to look into that in just 1 minute, right after a word from our sponsor.
So, you need some IA refresher credit, huh? We've all been there. Which one are you doing this time? The one with a 4-hour video hosted by a boring nerd? Or the one with a 50-page workbook printed on cheap paper? Wait a minute. What's this? The Aviation Maintenance Never Events is a brand new approach to preventing the 7 most common and most costly accidents that happen on the hangar floor. Watch videos that demonstrate the topic, learn while staying engaged with multiple interactive sections in each lesson, and dive into case studies that explore the depth and breadth of each of the 7 never events. So visit our website or give us a call to discover the power of a program that people are calling as big a leap forward in maintainer safety and training as simulators were for pilots.
Join us on our website at convergentperformance.com and click the link for e-learning to sign up for this exciting program today.
So welcome back. Now let's work into what the 4 different categories of risk takers are. And the first one is a natural risk taker. A natural risk taker is someone who is probably genetically encoded to take risks. They're adventurous. They want to try new things. And I like to say this is seen early in life. Right? I have 2 sons. My oldest son, very natural risk taker. We'd go for walks in the mountains and we'd see these big crevasses in the rocks and he'd leap over them and run off on his own and do a lot of things that I personally would not have done at my age, let alone when I was 6 or 7 years old. Yet, he never really got injured doing those things. Right? He had some sort of natural sense of what he could do and what he couldn't do. And so I'm not blessed with that, right? I have to think it through a little bit more. Natural risk takers get bored with the routine. They are probably a little more susceptible to those addictive behaviors of taking higher and higher risks. They typically have 1 or more high-risk hobbies or engage in high-risk lifestyles or even high-risk professions. That very same son is now all grown up and he's a professional firefighter in the city of San Antonio. Natural risk takers are often impatient. They want to get started on things. They want to get them done. And they're willing to make important risk decisions on the spot with limited information. Sounds crazy, but they have something else, something unique. Even though they're always up for new things and they want to make important decisions on the spot, they would rather ask for forgiveness rather than permission. They have something really, really interesting. And that is when they hit their personal risk threshold, they seem to have an innate ability, an instinct that guides them to stop. Right? Because if they didn't, evolution would have washed them out of the gene pool a long time ago, right? So when you're with or around, or if you are a natural risk taker, it's really important to look for those signals that they've hit their risk threshold. We can learn a lot by giving respect to things that they won't do or are uncomfortable doing. A year or 2 ago, working on some electrical things down at my well pump with my son, this natural risk taker who's now grown up, and we're down there working on it together, and there's a metal cover, and he said, "Dad, it's not working, but that box is still going to be hot, so be very careful touching the metal cover, because if the reason it's not working is one of those wires popped off and it's grounded out to the cover, you could electrocute yourself." And I'm kind of listening with one ear and not listening to him with the other ear. I'm in a hurry to get this done. It's cold outside. And I reached down to grab this cover, and he said, "You're making me very uncomfortable." And I stopped. And then I said, "Say all that stuff you just said." "Oh, that makes sense." So I didn't do it. And we got the well fixed. Long story short. But I've learned to listen because I am not a natural risk taker. And by having one around me and they said, "You're making me really uncomfortable," that was a red flag. So we'll come back to natural risk takers in a minute. I am personally what I consider a learned risk taker. A learned risk taker develops their sense of risk from their mentors, from their teachers, from watching others. And it can be a pretty wide level of being very risk accepting or risk tolerant or very risk intolerant, depending on where you learned and from whom. So most of you know I grew up in the United States Air Force, and there's a lot of high risk things we do, right? We fly fingertip formation and do all kinds of high-speed flying, low level at night, and all of that kind of stuff. But it's all done very methodically, right? You talk about it, then you practice it in a simulator, then you do it for real with somebody that's going to prevent you from getting hurt. And after you've done all those things enough, they sign you off and say, you can make your own risk decisions here. So it appears that combat aviators are naturally high risk takers, but they're probably not all natural risk takers. A lot of us are learned risk takers. If you learn from someone in an environment where they're ultra cautious all the time, you can be a learned risk taker, but still have a very low risk threshold. What I think learned risk takers have that's really valuable that natural risk takers perhaps do not have is what you're seeking is minimum risk required to accomplish the task, right? So that's a kind of a pretty specific thing, right? How much risk am I willing to accept for the reward of accomplishing this task? And we have pretty clear criteria on when the reward begins to get a little bit below the risk, and then we say knock it off, and we don't do it, right? So that's another characteristic of a learned risk taker. But just like every other category, you can fall into that adrenaline addiction and lose track of this skill very easily. And it happens to flyers a lot. It happens to other people in high risk activities. And there's another weird thing about learned risk takers that's really good to know, especially if you're one like me. Some people think that the risk management skills that they learned in their profession, for me, it's aviation, right, will transfer seamlessly into other activities. They don't. Each activity comes with its own risks. And so I can say, sure, I can drive that big rig with a trailer because I've handled heavy equipment before in a lot more hazardous situations than this. And that's probably not true at all, right? So it can be a common and sometimes lethal flaw when we think that because we're a great learned risk taker in one particular area of our lives, that will apply to other things. So let's move on to how we can personally and organizationally use our risk takers, natural or learned, right? First of all, you can't make progress without risk, so we have to allow our risk takers to take risks in order to move us forward. They have to be carefully monitored, right? And we're going to get into a discussion here on cultural risk takers in just a second, because if your risk takers take risks and people that are neither natural nor learned risk takers are watching them, they might just think they can do it too. So that's a problem, one we'll come back to. It's also important to understand that risk takers are unhappy when they're stymied or unable to try new ideas. So we can't greenlight everything that a natural risk taker or a learned risk taker wants to do, not for ourselves, not for our kids, not for our coworkers, but we should allow them to recognize and use their own individual attributes and risk decisions to the maximum extent possible. Now let's talk about this third category, and this is a scary one, cultural risk takers. And basically a cultural risk taker is going to say everybody else is doing it, it must be safe, right? Even though they don't have learned risk-taking capacity or natural risk-taking capacity, they get caught up with those that do. And they may not have the skills, they may not have the experience, they may not have the wisdom or judgment to be able to do the things that others that are doing because they haven't had the same experience, right? Social acceptance is so huge in our society, peer pressure is so huge in our society that it convinces these cultural risk takers without the natural instincts or learned management skills to do things that are dangerous. And that's very, very bad. Very, very bad. So don't be a cultural risk taker. Be aware of those you might be influencing. Now the fourth category, and perhaps the most fascinating, naturally cautious people. Naturally cautious people aren't going to jump into anything, right? They prefer to put their toe in the water to test the temperature before jumping in over their heads. These people tend to default to what they already know works, unless there's a change, right? So you're following your GPS to your location, and suddenly it comes up and says, alternate route available, save 6 minutes, right? So if it's me, I'm pushing that little alternate route and I'm off. 6 minutes of my life, that's huge. A naturally cautious person will say, hey, look, that takes us right through an unseemly part of town. Perhaps this is not the smartest thing to do. Right? Let's look at this a little bit more. Right? So naturally cautious people can keep you out of a lot of trouble if you're around them. They're wary of anything new, unproven processes, unproven tools. They're the last to download some new app. They research everything before they buy. They look before they leave. Naturally cautious people are not in a hurry. They want more data. They want more input. That doesn't mean that they're completely risk averse, because they're not. They just want to understand. In the extreme, they may miss out on opportunities that are only temporarily available in favor of the status quo, but they're seldom going to get themselves in trouble. And they're a super great counterbalance for risk takers. It's why we all have somebody in that other seat that says, yeah, you don't want to go through town with that gas gauge right on empty, because what happens if there's a stop on the freeway? What happens if that gas station you think you know is closed? What happens if something else, right? So naturally cautious people are a great counterbalance in a team full of risk takers. So keep that in mind as well. So let's talk a little bit about a few do's and don'ts around these 4 categories. 2 do's and 2 don'ts. Do realize that every decision is in some way a risk decision. If you begin to think about all your decisions in a risk-reward manner, sounds a little nerdy, is a little nerdy, but you become more comfortable thinking that way. Your estimations. Remember last week we talked about Clausewitz, and he said emotion, reason, and chance, right? So emotion will drive you into action, right? Reason will help guide you find the best way, and chance is what you're trying to manage by mixing both of these things. Well, we get better at it as we practice. So when I think about, mowing the lawn, or what time I want to arrive at a function, or any of those things, I try to view it as risk and reward, and execute so that I am tipping the scales of chance in my favor. Even if it's something as stupid as saying, I want to arrive exactly at 5:46 tonight for that 6 o'clock Little League game. Why? No particular reason. 15, 20 minutes early is fine. But if I challenge myself to think that way, I'm becoming more precise in the decisions that I make. So do realize every decision is in some way a risk decision, and practice that skill of estimation. Do make sure that the concerns of your cautious side, even if you're a natural risk taker, even if you're a learned risk taker, we have a cautious side, or if you're around cautious people, make sure that doesn't get steamrolled by the enthusiasm in your pursuit of the goal, of your riskier side. This give and take within yourself and within a team is really the recipe for making the best possible risk decisions. Don't rush into big risks. If there's time to slow down and investigate options, leave room for that. What's a big risk? Any one-way decision gate, right? Anything that you can't undo, anything you don't have a contingency plan for, or anything that puts something of real value to you at risk, be that your relationships, your career, your reputation, your personal safety. So even if you're really leaning forward and you're a natural risk taker and you've learned a lot and experienced a lot and had success, stop and think around the big risks. Finally, back to Ms. Scholl's quote from the beginning. Don't miss out on opportunities by living a small, safe life. That's, in our humble opinion here at Only Human, not a good way to live, right? We'll never know what we're capable of unless we bump up against some of those limitations along the way. It's critical that we learn to take risks, smart risks. When we fail, we learn how we failed. When we succeed, we don't necessarily build inertia for taking wild or crazy risks, but we analyze a little bit about what we did that allowed us that success. And that will inform our risk decisions in the future. So why does this matter at all? Beyond not living a small life and seizing opportunities and all that stuff, which is a pretty big deal, it matters to us because when we understand ourselves, our personal risk thresholds, we better understand those of others, right? When someone doesn't agree on a course of action, it may not be because they don't have the data or they're cowards or whatever it is. It may simply be that they're uniquely and wondrously different than we are. Could be genetic, could be learned, it could be they're a naturally conscious person. So it helps us with better teamwork. It helps us with better understanding. It helps us to really unify around a shared set of capabilities instead of relying exclusively on our own. Here's another thing. When we begin to practice all of these things off duty, right, when we're not at work or we're not engaged in a high-risk activity, when we are practicing risk management, we become far better at it. We're more attuned to how we apply this stuff everywhere, right? Do I clip the coupons and save a few bucks at the store? Is it worth the time or not worth the time? You know what? I'm starting to look for those online things right now. I've got, what is that, GoRx prescription stuff. I go in and I put that coupon up and they said, yeah, man, you just saved 20 bucks. Whatever it is, that's practicing risk management in the most mundane things in life. And when you do that, you are building that skill set for the day when your very life may depend on you making good decisions. Risk management is and has always been a life skill first and a job skill second, but we're not often taught that way. We're taught that as some part of a professional curriculum in a high risk activity like I used to be in and like many of you are still in. I think that training is excellent. I think it's very important, but I think it's equally important that we extend that into our off-duty lives so that we can practice it more often and increase our expertise at the risk management skills. So I guess we'll wrap this whole thing up by leaning in a little bit to next week and reflecting on where we've been. We've talked a whole lot about problem solving and how we create options and work through problem solving and make decisions. And we're moving into leadership. And we're going to talk next about a particular mode of leadership that many of us have been through. I hinted at it here and talked about it a little bit here today. And that's our influence. And particularly, we're going to use case studies of parenting. Right? How do we pass along what we know to the next generation? How much rope do we give them? When do we pull it back? How do we make sure that what we are doing, what influence that we have, because leadership is all about influence, right? It's not about commanding. It's not about, a little bit about that, a little bit about setting rules, but it's all about influence to shape the critical thinking skills and behavioral skills of someone else. And when we think about leadership and our role in shaping someone else, who will then shape someone else and someone else and someone else, it becomes a lot easier to understand how vital it is that we practice sound principles and consistently practice them if we want to have the maximum influence over others. So from problem solving through a little tiny bit of risk management and into how to have influence as a leader, and that's not just professionally, but it's within your family and it's cross-generationally and it's so many, many things. That will take us on the next couple of episodes. And I believe, I promised this once before, but I believe the next episode will be the first one when you get to hear somebody other than me. We're going to have a guest on board to help us discuss this, some of the strategies for influencing, particularly high-achieving children. So please tune in for that one. In the meantime, keep doing all the things that we suggest. Look for opportunities to get better. Look for opportunities to make someone else better. Live a proactive, positive life and get that coffee cup, right? tinyurl/tonykern. The 15-ouncer is the one I've got, but they got a 12-ouncer. It's a little bit cheaper. High-quality materials. Please like, subscribe, and share this with your friends. We're really doing something important here, and we're really starting to appreciate and get a lot more feedback. So thank you. And until episode 32, I will see you soon.